history at Le Moyne College in Syracuse, New York, and the author of Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, which was published in 2017 by Oxford University Press. It is a biography of the great African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass through the eyes of the women who made him. Her book won the 2018 Herbert Lehman Prize for Scholarship in New York History and the Society of Historians of the Early Republic's 2018 Mary Kelly Prize, and was a finalist for the Lapidus Center's 2018 Harriet Tubman Prize. Bott served as an associate editor on the first volume of Frederick Douglass's correspondence at the Frederick Douglass Papers, published by Yale University Press in 2009. Her previous work includes Southern Womanhood and Slavery, a biography of Louisa McCord, published by the University of Missouri Press in 2003, and 2006's Mystic, Connecticut, From Pequot Village to Tourist Town, from the History Press. So please help me welcome Leigh Bott.
I have to get situated up here first. I always have a hard time with how to set up the papers, and I want a teleprompter. However, I'm not the president. So with the current one, I do have a similar case of verbal diarrhea. Okay, that's going out on Facebook there. I record myself for Facebook, so hi Carl, my brother, 50, happy birthday, year old. Okay. Anyway, well, thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Pat, for suggesting me. Thank you, Tom, for inviting me. Thank you, Karina, for all of your logistic work. Thank you for such incredible presentations, and thank you everybody who I met today. It just, when I see this project online, my mind is blown. But to see everybody who's involved in working in it, it's such an incredible project as a research project, just for researchers, but also as an educational project for the people who are working on it, for a tool for teachers out there to use to educate their students, just as I hesitate to say this, but a job training project, as it's an amazing tool that brings, again, these wonderful stories out to the public. And I'm in awe. And I've been so fortunate to have come here ages ago to work, I feel like ages ago, it's like yesterday, but then I start counting the years back, and it's about a decade ago, to work in the Post family papers before they were online, and to work in the Porter papers. And before that, when the Douglass papers were up, which was back in the early 2000s, they were such a boon to have them available to me when I couldn't travel here. So again, thank everybody who's been involved in this project. And again, I'm really honored to be here. So to start with, women in the world, where's my, that boy, I stepped on my grand opening there. So to start with, women in the world of Frederick Douglass would not have existed if it weren't for Margaret Sanger. Now, I know you are asking, in what weird 6 degrees of separation world does Margaret Sanger have anything to do with Frederick Douglass? Well, in my weird world. Because you see, when Professor Slaughter invited me here to speak, and I asked, well, what should I speak on? And he suggested documentary editing, women, Frederick Douglass, something in your wheelhouse. So with that in mind, and because this is essentially a documentary editing project, and because my wheelhouse is long and winding stories, as you can tell, rather than give you the usual Women in the World of Frederick Douglass book talk, I decided to tell you the story about the ways that this book, the one that is for sale behind you, lovely logo price, how it originated in documentary editing. And that is where Margaret Sanger comes in. Because way back in the summer of 2000, which was the summer, it was the final summer of my doctoral dissertation program, which I was supposed to be spending 100% of my time on my dissertation. I took an internship at the Margaret Sanger Papers at NYU. And I like to say that this had something to do with my dissertation topic, or because I wanted more experience in documentary editing, or something professional and intellectual like that. But actually, I lived in Houston, Texas at the time, and I didn't travel a lot. And I really, I'd never been to New York City, and really the prospect of a summer in New York City was really exciting. And what a summer it was. I mean, New York City, I was, 30? I turned 30 that summer. It was great. It was just, I've never been there. But on top of that, I'm working in a documentary editing project. And to be honest, I didn't really know much about it until I took that project. But this was a great experience, because my favorite part was the annotation, because it took me into the documents in a way I hadn't really been trained to before. And I mean, this is really late in the game to be discovering this, but how you could go and just suss out so much information from a document. And if you couldn't suss it from the document itself, you could go and find it. And I mean, the first thing they had me go do was go figure out who this, well, they had to go down to this office down by the courts that you always see on Law and Order, and pull out a passport application of this Greek man who they believed was Margaret Sanger's lover, and they had pieced together that it might be him. It was just an amazing experience. Just this level of research. So it was awesome, and it was almost like a magic spell. And then I had to go home. And I went home, and I finished my dissertation in a shocking amount of time. And I graduated that December, and I honestly didn't know what was going to happen next. And I was kind of 80% sure I'd probably end up in a library science program, that that was kind of an avenue I was exploring. I was 100% sure I was ambivalent about a traditional academic career. And I was biding my time at a part-time office job and piecing together adjunct work. I kind of had options, really. And then on the HNet listserv jobs, up pops assistant editor at the Frederick Douglass papers at IUPUI. I mean, in my guts, I wanted that job. Now, I had spent like 4 or 5 years neck deep in the life of Louisa S. McCord, who is an anti-women's rights, pro-slavery, South Carolinian narcissist. Frederick Douglass was going to be a bomb. Okay. And so I applied for the job, and because of my experience at the Sanger papers, and because I don't think too many other people applied for the job, I got it. And so I moved to Indianapolis, and I lived there for 3 years. And for those 3 years, we worked on this volume. Okay. And this, that's the bottom is kind of their digital presence right now. They still don't have much of a digital presence, but the fact that they have digitized, like even this volume, is fantastic, because trying to get a hold of all of the volumes of the Douglass papers, all of the speeches, is difficult. I've worked our interlibrary loan librarian to death on that, but that was the building we worked in, 3rd floor, right in the middle, one room, me. The editor was upstairs in his own office, which was about the size of our office, and then a rotating set of interns, like 1 or 2, all working on this. And but it was really, I loved working on this project. Okay. And so this first volume covers Frederick Douglass from 1842 to 1852. Okay. So these are like really from the first time he starts writing letters. Well, probably not the first time he starts writing letters, the first letters that are extant, okay, to 1852. And during this time, he emerges as a professional abolitionist and editor. And during this time, he enters the lecturing field. He publishes his first autobiography. He tours England, Ireland, and Scotland. He gets his legal freedom purchased. He sets up his newspaper here in Rochester, and he begins this very public, acrimonious, ideological break with the American Anti-Slavery Society, specifically William Lloyd Garrison, that involved the worst sort of mudslinging. So, I mean, this was awesome. And working on it felt like working on a biography of Douglass without actually having to write a biography of Douglass. In fact, working on the project forced me to think more carefully about what a biographer does when they piece together a person's life. And once again, through the annotation, I was able to enter Douglass's world and walk around and just ask questions about what was happening there. You know, in a way that, I mean, the granular kind of research you do when you're doing that annotation is something that when you're just writing a big monograph, or it was not something I had really thought about, and here I was, oh, wait, who is Joe? And who is this person? And understanding at this point, and this is what, 2001, 9/11 happened like 2 weeks after I moved to Indianapolis, so it was an exciting period of time. You know, at this point, I wasn't thinking about a book. In fact, I was kind of relieved that I didn't have the pressure of having to publish or got that other book project. I was not sure if I could write another book-length thing like a dissertation again. I wasn't sure I could think up another book-length thing again. And yet, working on this project and the work I was doing actually led me to another book-length thing. For sale at the back of the room. And it began because the research here started to reveal the holes in the Douglass scholarship, and I wasn't looking for the holes in the Douglass scholarship. It just started to emerge because my own curiosity drove me towards those empty spaces that became more apparent as we started to fill out the context of what was ultimately 230-ish letters. And, well, the whole process usually, it begins with the selection of the documents. And selection usually takes place very early at the beginning of a print edition. And because of the constraints of a print edition and the pricing and all of this kind of, you know, material concerns, it has to be very precise. You have to be, you know, you are in fact making interpretive decisions when you're doing those selections. And so this shapes a narrative in the collection, even when the collection claims to be comprehensive. So for instance, if you look at the 6-volume published letters of William Lloyd Garrison, you'll notice that it tells essentially a fairly standard narrative that you might find in any biographical encyclopedia. Helen Garrison, his wife, Mariah Weston Chapman, who is, well, she's another story, but she's pretty awesome. The ladies' anti-slavery societies who supported his work. Ladies in general are largely absent, as is a work that they did in the home and in their organizations. And that's quite a different view from what you'll find if you go to archive.org or go to the Boston Public Library and look at the William Lloyd Garrison papers there. Even if you look at Claire Taylor's edited edition, British and American Abolitionists, in which much of the correspondence is actually taking place among the corresponding secretaries of the abolitionist societies, who were usually women. And so they're talking about the business of abolition. And when I say business, I literally mean business, and I'll get back to that. And also such things as, you know, the baby is dying, the bills are due, when are you coming home? These sorts of things just kind of impose themselves on the story. And you can even say the same thing about Philip Foner's 5 volumes of Douglass's writing, which was the first published edition of Douglass's life and writings. And because he mostly focused on previously published documents, more public sort of a persona of Douglass. But with this edition, they're making different choices because they envision more volumes, first of all, and they intended to publish only the correspondence. Like, for instance, Philip Foner was putting in speeches, he was putting in letters, he was putting in editorials, so he's putting in a different bunch of things. Whereas they had already published a volume of just speeches. and they were publishing critical editions of the autobiography. So this is just going to be the correspondence, which then forced different choices. And then at this particular period of his life, few letters have survived. And so that meant that there are going to be different or fewer decisions about what you're going to cut out of the volume. On top of that, by the time they started making the decisions about what to include, there had been scholarship on women in abolition, which brought ladies to the attention of the scholars who were making the editorial choices. So letters to or from women, letters addressing the work of women, letters offering glimpses into Douglas's home life, all started to make their way into the volume. And appearing in the volume, they required the explanation of annotation. Annotation, however, based on the kinds of annotation methods they had been using for speeches, they were relying on secondary sources. Okay. Unfortunately, this started to reveal some of the weaknesses in those secondary sources, particularly the biographies. And at the time, the main, most recent scholarly edition on biography of Douglas was William McFeely's. So when we started to notice those holes in the biographies, or those weaknesses in the biographies, then we had to start doing more primary research to make sure that what we were saying and annotating those letters was actually accurate for future scholars. And one of my favorite examples of this, I love her. Okay, there's the correspondence. I didn't read what's going on in the first volume. Was this woman. Okay. Harriet Bailey or Ruth Cox, and then she marries a man, last name is Adams. I just gave away the punchline. Okay. We first encountered her in the letters as my sister Harriet. The first letters to Bailey, the name she went by at the time, were written by Douglas during his first trips to England, and oh my God, they shock you with their intimacy. And I don't mean like romantic intimacy, but that he writes to her with this honesty about his loneliness and a dialect. And he in fact uses the N-word in this, but he uses it in the word kind of like the in-group way of using that word. No guile. And this teasing voice, and this familiarity that among the letters that are around it, these stand out for their familiarity. He exhibits a little bit of the patriarch in it that you see later in his letters to his daughter Rosetta. For instance, how dare Harriet consent to marry someone without checking with him first? I mean, is that how a good sister treats a good brother? I mean, and it's just this amazing, wonderful, charming, astonishing claim. Yet if you return to William McFeely's biography in order to annotate this, you will find that he not only summarily dismisses her as unimportant, but that he identified her as one of two different women living in the Douglas household at the same time, the other being Ruth Adams, who wrote to Douglas in the 1890s. And so I'm sitting here going, okay, we've got a Ruth Adams and we've got a Harriet Bailey, and I'm doing this research on the Harriet Bailey, and I know she gets married, and this is where I find it so frustrating when women get married and they change their names and you don't know who the husband is, and then when she's fugitive and Harriet Bailey's not her real name anyway, oh my God. Okay. Well, something seemed off there, and as I started to investigate, I found that these letters, the Ruth Adams ones and the Harriet Bailey ones, they had been donated as a set, as a group, to the Library of Congress by a Nebraska family back in the 1970s. So they're called Edition 1, and they're not digitized. They're a set that's not digitized. And I found that the man that Harriet had decided to marry, dared to marry without Douglas's consent, was a man named Harry F. Adams of Springfield, Massachusetts. Ruth Adams, Harriet Bailey marries Harry F. Adams, and I could trace on their children and where they lived to Springfield and where they're. It's grand. So is this a coincidence? Well, of course not. They were one and the same person. Okay. What was a coincidence was that, I swear, the very moment I'm doing this annotation, the phone rings. It's the Nebraska State Historical Society. They've just gotten a collection donated to them. It's the rest of the collection. The family that had donated these letters to the Library of Congress are donating the rest of that collection to the Nebraska State Historical Society. And it's stuff, I mean, it's a whole family history, but it's a sewing box that he refers to in one of the letters. It's pictures, I mean, that picture there in the middle, that's her. You know, when I saw the picture for the first time after chasing her through the documents, I was like, there she is. And, no, I was just, I was so in love with her. So, you know, it was amazing. So they could put their end of the story together, and I could put my end of the story. It was amazing. So, you know, and I kept following, you know, the story of her. I mean, I went way into her. And what I discovered was that this story, it took her from enslavement in Talbot County, eastern Talbot County, where Frederick Douglass was from, in the house of Congressman John Leeds Kerr. She escaped to Pennsylvania State Houses, one step ahead of the auctioneer. Then she ended up in the Douglass household in Lynn, almost went to Britain, got married. In Springfield, she's mixed up with John Brown and a vigilance committee called the League of Gileadites, who were hardcore in Springfield. She immigrates to Haiti during the Civil War, returns, and then ends up in Nebraska. And I have a whole article on her that I haven't yet had published, but I could talk for ages about her. But anyway, here's this story that is, you know, her story is far more pragmatic and vulnerable, you know, than that of Douglass. And again, that's another story for another time. But the whole point here being is that the experience of delving into her story, you know, of following these avenues away from the standard secondary sources and biographies in order to give an accurate explanation of this woman to whom Douglass wrote these one-of-a-kind letters. I mean, there's nothing really like this that he writes to anyone. Shifted the location of this story away from the usual newspapers and lecterns into Douglass's home, to a self-emancipated woman living in the house of a self-emancipated man, and to the effort in that household to make him, Frederick Douglass, the emerging abolitionist celebrity, actually happen. And then moving that into the home, Anna Douglass, who essentially harbored not one to whom she was married, but two fugitives from the law. She started not to seem just the cliche of the woman behind the man, or, oh, well, she was an abolitionist because, you know, she helped out the Lynn Anti-Slavery Society. She's an outlaw. She's living in defiance of the law. So there's this kind of lived abolition of her life. And so what I started to see was their home is now a politicized household. And I hadn't seen that really anywhere else described as such. And so this started to become part of a bigger picture or problem that had begun to define itself, you know, at least for me, that we had, you know, basically two bodies of literature with which to annotate all of these letters. Okay? And so while you could expect kind of a Venn diagram to emerge here, where you would have, you know, letters with women doing things, the body of literature of abolition and women, and in the Frederick Douglass scholarship, you would expect some overlap. But there wasn't as much as you would imagine. In fact, what I was seeing was a lot of disconnect. And out of curiosity, I started to investigate third-party correspondence. And what are people saying around Douglass? What are they saying not to or from him, but to each other about him, the gossip, really. And much of this is in the Boston Public Library because, oh my God, if you don't have anything nice to say, go sit next to the American Anti-Slavery Society. Boy, are they a gossipy bunch. And especially read the letters between Maria Weston Chapman and Richard D. Webb in Dublin. Boy, those are two catty bunches. They would say something nasty about somebody's hat, too. They criticized Julia Griffith's dress, but that's another thing. So anyway, so I started to look in there. That was my first place. And then I found more of it in the Post papers, more of it in the Porter papers, more in the Clements Library where the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society papers ended up, and even in the Garrett Smith papers in Syracuse. And what I found was a lot of discussion about money, because it's all about the dollar. Was there enough to help the liberator? Was there enough to support the National Anti-Slavery Standard? What was going to happen to the Anti-Slavery Bugle out in Ohio? Were black lecturers going to be paid the same as white lecturers? How much do you pay black columnists versus white columnists in those newspapers? Would the Liberty Party lure Douglass away with the promise of more money? How much was being raised for the fair? How much was being raised at that fair? How much could you donate to the Boston Anti-Slavery Fair? How much in the wake of a Douglass lecture? On and on and on. And if you read the literature on women in abolition, you weren't that surprised because they're the ones with the fairs. But if you read the Douglass scholarship, you would never know that this was really that much of a concern. Okay, or you might, but for instance, William McFeely describes these women are wasting their talents, creating these monstrosities to sell. And I thought that was an unfair interpretation too when you start looking at the things that they're creating, because they're creating practical, they're creating babies' hats, and they're creating shawls and aprons and things that are being sold. They're actually practical things. And then they're pretty things which fits into the Victorian, but blah, 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 blah. Okay, focus. So anyway, or you would think that, oh, well, Douglass is just bad with money, which is a little, or that his appeals for donations to paper are kind of, unsavory for his paper are kind of unsavory, or that, he's asking for extra money to send to his wife, when that was probably actually just his wages that he was asking to be sent directly to his wife, because she's the one who handled the money. Okay, so let's go back. Remember that sketch that I gave you earlier about what goes on in this? Okay. So the correspondence that covered up papers. I lost my place in my paper. It happens. Okay, so that sketch, if you strip out the financial and practical concerns, the conflict of the story takes place among men. Over ideological differences, it comes to a head over Garrison accusing Douglass of an extramarital affair under the same roof as his wife and 5 children, no less, among other guests, with Julia Griffiths, who has no clearly defined function. If you layer in those concerns, however, the women and the women who attended them, and who also had their own activist agenda, then you have a much more logical series of events. It also upend assumptions about Douglass's alleged marital infidelity that continues to undergird many scholarly and popular interpretations about his life among women. Okay? And the more logical, if less sexy, chain of events goes like this. Okay? Douglass wanted to learn an living, to pursue abolition, and to raise his family. He essentially wanted to do what every other middle-class 19th century man wanted to do, which is to be self-reliant, which is really important if you're African American. Okay. English women provided him with the funds to do so, but the leadership of the American Anti-Slavery Society, with Maria Weston Chapman as one of the key figures in the fundraising efforts there, and that's her in the upper corner on the far side, the profile. thwarted his plans because there were only so many abolitionist dollars to go around, and the society could not help support one more paper, especially since at the time he was hoping to set up around Boston. Okay, so he finds more fertile ground here in Rochester, okay, where Amy Post, and I think you all know who she is, she needs no introduction, a key figure in the fundraising organization here, very happily welcomed and provided him with the kind of institutional support that could sustain his paper because his presence would galvanize flagging abolitionist sentiment here in Western New York. Okay? And in fact, if I have one quarrel with Nancy Hewitt's Amy Post biography that is otherwise wonderful, it's that I don't think she gives Amy Post enough credit for bringing Frederick Douglass here. Anyway, so the American, so she brings him here. But that was still not enough because, as they put at the time, the anti-slavery warfare is fierce, more so to those who face the pecuniary burdens. So the American Anti-Slavery Society kind of eagerly awaited. It's all in that third-party correspondence. Is he going to fail? We're not going to help him out. We're not going to try to hurt him, but we're not going to help him out. It's probably much better if he fails because then he'll come back to the fold, and then he can go back to speaking and helping us raise money. So they awaited his failure because it would eliminate competition, drive him back to their fold as one of their more popular lecturers. However, at that crucial point, Julia Griffiths, an Englishwoman who had taken interest in Douglass's cause while he was overseas, arrived with her sister Eliza. Seeing the paper in crisis, she was able to step in and help save it from collapse and allow him financial independence through different support mechanisms, such as the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society that she helped to found here, the philanthropy of Garrett Smith, and which she helped to cultivate, and her overseas connections, which brought in quite a bit of money. She made Douglass and his paper a viable competition and allowed him greater ideological independence, which made her a threat. So here's, this increased her role as something other than, okay, this woman, English woman shows up. What other possible thing could she be doing there except sleeping with Frederick Douglass? Well, she's helping his paper survive. Okay. Now, lost my place again. So taken in this light, Garrison leveled accusations against them, not as statements of fact, but as weapons intended to eliminate Douglass and Griffiths by smearing Douglass in a way that would discredit both of them, not only as abolitionists, but as a respectable man and a respectable woman. And respectable being very important amongst the middle class. And in his case, smearing him not just as a respectable man, but as a respectable black man, okay, who is engaged in amalgamation. Indeed, such an accusation in another place could easily have ended up with Douglass at the end of the rope. And with Julia, it's meant to smear her and essentially imply that she's a prostitute. And they use such words as Jezebel. One image was Samson with his head in the lap of Delilah, which that's pretty racy in Victorian terms. So, furthermore, yet again, the Douglass household appears as a politicized place, both as a focus of Garrison's attack, but also in the ways that Douglass defended his home life, marriage, and family against this attack. And within that home, Anna, who always drew about her a reserve, as her daughter put it, she didn't want to be known. She had to navigate the demands of her husband and the work that encroached upon their family time, the expectations that she had of him, and her project with him of protecting their family from the types of attack that not only Garrison, but all sorts of other prying eyes leveled on their home as he became more of a public man. And once more, Anna, the Douglass family, and their household appeared to exist as a far more politically charged entity than previously considered. Yeah. So by the time I'm kind of getting into all of this, I began to realize that I had something to say on my own outside of editing. Because when you annotate, you kind of have to be that kind of very above it all tone, that very concise tone. I was starting to get opinions. And when I get opinions, watch out. And that's when I started to realize, oh, I have a book idea. Now, to say I had this after just 3 years of annotation, and I sat down and it all came together, that would be a lie. But after talking, I talked with my friend Bob, and I said, actually, what I want to do is a series of chapters that are biographical studies of each of these women. And he told me, no. Focus on the common thread, Douglas. And so Douglas became the common thread. And then I took a few detours. I did actually go to library school a bit. And eventually I came back to this story. I wrote another book. Then I came back to this, and it was one of these, I don't know if you've ever had this feeling that I have to do this thing, and if I die without doing this, there will be a hell, and it will be me regretting it into eternity. I'll be going, could have been a contender for the rest of my life. So I found myself back to this idea, a biography of Douglas, but the action would not be him, it was going to be what's around him. And it would move from wherever the men were to wherever the women were. Where the women were wasn't exactly private, it wasn't exactly public, it wasn't actually both, but it wasn't exactly either. And the analogy that I used then, that I use now, is negative space. The space around him. And I wanted to blur all of the men in that space and just bring the women into focus. And see what they had to tell me about themselves and about Douglas and about the world that they lived in. And little did I know the adventure was just beginning. And so that's how Margaret Sanger led to Women in the World of Douglas. So thank you.
So please join me in thanking Professor Fott as well as all of our other presenters today for their wonderful presentations. So, as Professor Fott has mentioned, Barnes & Noble is here today with copies of her books for sale. You really need to get one. Just do it. Go ahead and get one. And if you want to know more about any of the things we discussed today, the Sewards, Frederick Douglass, or the women in his world, we also have a display on the back that has some letters from both the family and the Douglass papers. We have food and refreshments as well. Please feel free to stay and mingle until 5 o'clock. Grab some food if you want. You can also grab any of the presenters today and ask them further questions. Thank you so much for coming. I really hope that you enjoyed it.